to this week's episode on Advocacy Project podcast. This week's episode focuses on the best ways to fund public education. I'm Maddie.
I'm Caroline.
And I'm Jordan.
So to start off with, we have the history of funding public education. Education was a way to advance society according to early colonists such as Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. They thought that early education was a way to separate themselves from British rule, and that's why they established schools. Jumping forward to the 19th century, more and more states began to establish their own public schools. These schools were primarily funded through local property taxes and donations from area businesses. Many states that did follow this format were Massachusetts and New York, had the most successful public schools. The federal government started to intervene with allocating more funding towards schools during the 1940s and 50s. This was as a result of the World War II and the Cold War, where the rise of the world powers demanded more scientists, so we needed more funding to our schools to compete with other world powers. During the 1960s, the Department of Education started allocating more funding towards schools that were more urban and had lower socioeconomic statuses. This was to better serve minority students in these schools, such as students in the Latinx and the African American populations. In the 1970s, San Antonio Independent School District versus Rodriguez was a Supreme Court case that dealt with public school funding. Rodriguez was a parent in the district who recognized the funding inequities that more urban schools had, and many families lived below the poverty line in that area, and their schools were suffering, so the funding the school was receiving was very minimal. The courts ended up ruling in favor of the San Antonio Independent School District because the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause did not guarantee public education funding. Today, funding in the 21st century comes from acts such as the No Child Left Behind Act and other tracking acts that have been established.
So now we're going to talk about the current ways of funding schools. So right now, school districts are being funded by local property taxes, which is not an efficient way to be funding schools. There are larger disparities between districts when it comes to how much is being taxed and the amount of money coming into the school. And this affects the poorer school districts because they're going to be taxed more, or they don't get enough in with a wealthier district. And then higher value properties aren't getting taxed as much as residential properties, which makes this whole system unfair.
Now we're going to look at the current problems with school funding in America. Okay, so researchers have found that increased funding has been directly linked to student achievement. There was a study done by the Washington Center for Equitable Growth on this issue, and what they found was states without reform events, the gap between high and low income schools actually increased over time. Low income school districts spend significantly less on their students, in some cases as much as $5,000 per student.
So now we're going to get into the best ways to fund schooling.
So the first one, make your school more sustainable. There are a lot of ways to do this, but it really starts with the school leaders, and they can make a difference by creating a more sustainable environment. The first option is to switch from old paper billing methods to online alternatives. This has helped narrow the many schools still stick to old paper systems for billing and payroll. Switching to an online resource can help reduce the cost of printing and the use of paper. The second way is be smart about electricity use. Ways you can do this are turn off lights in unoccupied rooms, use motion-activated lights, turn off computers and printers at night, and ensure heating and cooling systems run efficiently by scheduling regular maintenance. And just another stat on that, schools in the U.S. spend more than $6 billion per year on energy, but studies show that those costs could be cut by 25% if schools are smarter about their energy use. And simple changes can go a long way. A school in Seattle saved $20,000 a year just by turning off the lights in a vending machine.
Now, the second one is search for cost-effective or no-cost options. So one thing is to find where there is unnecessary spending, and when buying equipment and technology, be aware of what is being purchased so that you're like getting most for your money. And like another example is like buy used or refurbished computers, because they may not be like the newest brand, but they're still like working and they're still like pretty up to date. So it still is helpful for students to use.
A third way to best invest in public education is actually investing in our teachers. Students will succeed with their teachers, and funding teachers fosters student success. So students will more likely succeed in classrooms when funding is actually available to their teachers. Like in the case of San Antonio Independent School District, a lot of teachers were paying out of pocket, and there was no adequate funding for the resources for their students. Another reason to invest in your teachers is schools pay for the results they want. If schools want better state testing scores, national testing scores, whatever, they want their students to be able to be taught by the best teachers. The more money schools put into their teachers, the better they are. Investing more into their teachers' salaries also helps rather than investing more into their benefits. This encourages teachers to stay with school districts instead of leaving every so many years. And also prioritizing the funding. Schools are on tight budgets, and you need to really watch the dollars and cents. Putting money towards school staff can lead towards higher satisfaction rates among teachers, among other things.
Number 4 is to stay on top of contract renewals. So be aware when like your contracts with different businesses end to ensure that you're spending your money wisely. And you can use that as a chance to look at what your cost with this company for this service is, and maybe look elsewhere to see if you can get just as good of a service, but to reduce the cost and find like the best price for your school district, because there's a lot of unnecessary spending with all the contracts outside of the school.
And then the 5th way is to use your school site to raise funds. Schools have the ability to generate their own income, and it's possible for schools to even rent out their facilities to the public. Each school can get creative about ways to raise funds. So what they need to do is start by analyzing the spaces the school has at the times those spaces aren't being used. Then get in contact with local organizations to see who might need the space and make it clear to organizations in town that you have that space to rent.
So one of our final points is the importance of funding public education. By investing in public education, you're giving more students more equal opportunities, like allocating the resources to those schools that need the funding to provide meals for their students or provide more enriching academic opportunities as well. There's also a correlation between funding and high achievement. The more funding a school receives, the higher achievement students do. And again, that goes back to the resources that the funding can provide. And just making sure we compensate our teachers fairly and adequately. A lot of teachers are underpaid, and by increasing teacher salaries, they're going to be more likely to stay in the classroom and be able to provide that quality education that all students deserve.
Education is not the filling of a pail, but the lighting of a fire. So our end goal here is just to show that there are better ways to fund public education, because public education is so important. If public education is meant to provide every child, no matter his or her background, with the opportunity to learn, grow, and thrive, then funding for public schools must be raised in a way that is aligned with this mission, fairly and equitably, in a manner that supports rather than harms needy communities. Money can be hard to come by, but there are options out there to fund public education. Funding is especially important in schools when it comes to resources in classrooms or updating the school itself. It is especially key to remember that all students deserve a fair and well-rounded education, and to make that happen, schools need to be funded properly. If the government won't give money out to schools that is needed, it's important to be creative when being cost efficient and think about the points that were shared in this presentation.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of Advocacy Project presentations.